Hello science fans and welcome to SHE-ensya. Today, we go back to basics and talk about why diversity in life is important on planet Earth. In our last Back to Basics episode, we talked about how the immediate survival of living things depend on the flow of energy from producers to the various types of consumers. But also remember, survival during extreme changes in the environment require adaptation. There are two types of adaptation, and one of them is biological adaptation, where a change in structure or physiology occurs, often rooted in a mutation that helps an organism survive. And the other type of adaptation is behavioral modifications, which are changes in habits or manners that increase chances of survival. And both these types of adaptation have helped create a huge diversity of life on planet Earth. But when we say biodiversity, what do we mean? There are actually three levels of biodiversity, and the most popular one is species diversity. Species diversity accounts for the number of different species in a community or region. A high species diversity suggests that there is a large number of successful species in that environment and that it is a more stable ecosystem. A high species diversity indicates a complex food web in that habitat, and so environmental changes are less likely to be damaging to that ecosystem. Low species diversity, on the other hand, indicates few successful species in that habitat. It could imply that the environment is very stressful and that there are few organisms who are able to adapt to that environment. As such, food webs in places like this are relatively simple, and environmental changes would probably have serious consequences for the remaining organisms. Of course, when we're considering the species diversity of a particular area, we don't just count the number of species and leave it there. We also factor in species richness and species evenness. Species richness is the more straightforward value that measures the total number of species present in an ecosystem. It is interesting to note that tropical ecosystems tend to have greater species richness, as environmental conditions like temperature and water availability is conducive for the survival of a large number of species. Species evenness, on the other hand, refers to the relative abundance of individuals within a species in an ecosystem. If the number of individuals per species is fairly constant in a community, it is said to have high evenness. But if the number of individuals varies from species to species, it is said to have low evenness. For example, a reef with a high number of species but with varying numbers of individuals per species would be characterized as having high species richness but low species evenness. On the other hand, a forest where there are only a few plant species but all of these species have equally large numbers of individuals, it is described as having low species richness but high species evenness. Now, another measure of biological diversity is genetic diversity. Genetic diversity refers to the variation of genes within a species. Because even though the same species will have the same number of chromosomes, the versions of the genes they contain may be different. Each version of a gene is called an allele, and the higher number of alleles there are in a population, the higher the genetic diversity. Genetic diversity within a species is maintained through sexual reproduction. The offspring of two different organisms will carry within itself a unique combination of alleles that were inherited from both parents. And the process of meiosis, a special kind of cell division that results to the formation of our sex cells, even increases the genetic variation. And this is because of an event called crossing over that happens at the start of meiosis. This is when two chromosomes swap portions of their DNA and therefore resulting to the creation of brand new, unique chromosomes. But in organisms capable of asexual reproduction, like plants, genetic diversity can get lost. In crops, for example, they are sometimes grown from cuttings or grafting. And since no sexual reproduction takes place, the genetic content of the offspring will be exactly the same as the parent. It is important to have high genetic diversity because the different versions of our genes may contain the unique trait needed to survive a sudden or drastic change in the environment. Finally, there is ecosystem diversity, which is based on the different types of ecosystems supported by a biome or a biosphere. The uniqueness of an ecosystem is brought about by the combinations of living and non-living things within it. And given the vastness of Earth, the variations and fluctuations of temperature, the different availability of water, and more, we have enough foundations for rich ecosystem diversity. But because of careless industrialization and overpopulation, we are destroying unique ecosystems to create farms, factories, and subdivisions. This alters the abiotic setup of a location and leads to the displacement or death of the organisms living in that area. But each natural ecosystem has its own unique function, and what happens to one ecosystem can affect or alter the others around it. And so, with the destruction of ecosystem diversity, we are left to face Earth's feedback, which could be the failure of the natural systems we have depended on for our survival. And that's it for our Back to Basics video for this week. Just remember, there are 3 levels of biodiversity, with 1 being species diversity that refers to the different species within a community or region. And the higher the species diversity, the larger the number of successful species in that environment, and the more stable the ecosystem becomes. The second level of biodiversity is genetic diversity, that refers to the variation of genes within a species. The higher the genetic variation of a species, the greater the diversity in alleles, and the higher the chances that it possesses a unique trait that would allow its survival in the event of drastic environmental change. And the third level is ecosystem diversity, which is the different types of ecosystems supported by a biome or a biosphere. The higher the ecosystem diversity of planet Earth, the more stable are the systems that support life, that support our survival. So let us protect biodiversity by finding or creating a more sustainable way of life. Once we learn to coexist with the other living things on planet Earth, we could actually create a more long-lasting, comfortable way of thriving on planet Earth. I hope you were able to learn something from our short Back to Basics video this week. If you did, I hope you can give this video a thumbs up and also subscribe to our channel. If you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, please don't hesitate to message me, your resident Filipino scientist, in the comments section below. Thank you very much, and see you around!